Welcome to the Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture with leading experts on the Bible. Hosted by Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or at the2testaments.com, where you can also donate to support our work. Follow us on Twitter at the2testaments on Facebook or Instagram.
Welcome to the Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture. I'm Will Kynes.
And I'm Ronnie Cosman.
In this episode, we'd like to introduce you to the Gospel of Matthew. And we have with us Dr. Dale Allison Jr., who is going to give us a lay of the land for the journey that we're about to take through Matthew in this season.
Dr. Dale Allison Jr. is the Richard J. Dearborn Professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. He is the author of many books on the New Testament and on the Gospel of Matthew and on other things as well. He has written this massive 3-volume commentary on Matthew with W.D. Davies. This is just the first volume. So this is volume 1 of 3. So to say that we have an expert on Matthew would be an understatement. He's also written a number of other important books on Matthew. This book, Studies in Matthew, which is one of my personal favorite books, actually, on Matthew and on the New Testament. Interpretation, Past and Present is the subtitle. And also the Sermon on the Mount, Inspiring the Moral Imagination. And I may say something about one of the essays in the Studies in Matthew book, just because it's blew my mind when I first read it.
That's great.
Now, Dale, you've spent just a little bit of time thinking about the Gospel of Matthew and writing about it. And so we're glad to have you as an expert guide to guide us and our listeners through a journey, kind of orienting us to the lay of the land.
And we'd like to start with our guests and ask them what initially drew them to these topics. What first drew you to the Gospels and then Matthew in particular?
I mean, Dale, what would possess you to write this much on Matthew?
So what happened is this. When I went off to graduate school, I was primarily interested in the historical Jesus, and you don't really need to explain that interest. Everybody cares about Jesus, who this guy was. And at that point, I was aware that the Gospels weren't videotape perfect copies of history. So my primary interest was not the Gospels as we have them, but the history behind them, so the history of Jesus. And that's what I wanted to focus on. And I thought when I was writing my dissertation that my next project would be on the Gospel of Mark, and it would be asking historical questions about Mark. The problem is that the director of my dissertation, W.D. Davies, told me at some point that he had a contract to write a commentary on Matthew, and he said, "I'd like for you to write this with me." And I said, "No." And then he said, "Okay, well, we'll do it half and half. I'll write half the chapters, you write half the chapters." I said, "No." I do not remember, except, of course, he was, the reason why he finally broke me down and I said yes against my will. He was an imposing authoritative figure. He was directing my dissertation. So, you want to please him. I had no idea that was going to take a decade, almost a decade and a half of my life after I said yes. Anyway, it's not that I was attracted to Matthew. It's that somebody forced me into doing this. Now, once I got into it, I found Matthew compelling and attractive. And in retrospect, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have written on Matthew. But it wasn't my choice. It's just one of those things that happened. It's like life. You can't plan it.
So you got pulled into this arduous task of interpreting the Gospel of Matthew, and as you've been doing that, what have you found most difficult or challenging about interpreting or encountering the Gospel of Matthew?
Well, the first thing isn't going to help your listeners at all because it's a professional complaint. But when I started in the 80s, I still had some sort of illusion that I could read most of at least the important things that had been written on this text. There's been an explosion of literature in the last few decades, and nobody, in my judgment, can keep up with anything anymore. Mm-hmm. And if you try, it's just exhausting. So I started the commentary on Matthew when I was in my 20s. I had a lot more energy than I have today, and I finished it when I was in my 30s. But today, I'm just in despair when I look at all the new books and the new articles. And if I want to keep up with more than just one small little thing, I'm completely overwhelmed. So that's one challenge. There are lots of important things and good things being written that I know I'm never going to be able to read. The other thing that's a challenge, and this is more relevant, I suppose, to your listeners, is that Matthew is from another time. It's from another place. It was written by somebody who lived in a completely different world. And everything in this text requires me to ask, what the heck did that word mean in the first century? You know, when you refer to Brad Pitt, everybody knows who you're talking about, right? But if it's Herod Antipas, you got to go to a dictionary and figure this out. And what did people think about this guy when he was alive? What did they think about him when he was dead? What were the legends and associations of his name and so on? And just every single thing. I don't know if we want to get into this later, but you just pick a little word like star, which shows up in the second chapter of Matthew, and then you realize at some point, you know, people didn't think about stars the way we do back then, and it actually becomes relevant for how the text was understood in the first century and how it was understood until very recent times. I don't know any eunuchs. Do you guys know any eunuchs? I don't know them, but the word shows up. So what the heck is a eunuch? And, you know, what did people think about them? And how does a saying about eunuchs function in Jesus's time and place or Matthew's time and place? So, I remember somebody asking me once when I was in graduate school, what do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I want to be a first century Jew. That's my aspiration. And it's because I wanted to understand Jesus and I wanted to understand Matthew. And I realized that if I want to get back to the intention of these characters and this text, that I'm going to have to spend my life as an historian. So that's thrilling and it's wonderful, but it's also very, very difficult. And at every turn, you just say, wow, that's different than how I think or how we think. So, so those are two things. One other thing, just very, very briefly, is that my own complaint is that Christians are always mashing everything together and conflating everything together. And if everything's in the canon, then they assume they all speak with one voice. But I think Matthew has a little different view of things than Mark, and that Matthew has a little different view of things than Paul. So the goal for me is, first of all, to understand them on their own terms. And then if you're interested in a higher theological synthesis, that can come later. But first of all, I want to understand what they themselves are saying without reading Paul into Matthew from the beginning and assuming they must agree on absolutely everything.
That's great. And we're going to return to that issue of Matthew's distinct contribution. But what I want to do now is you also led us into the important question of the historical setting of Matthew. So let's think about that, because it's important to orient us to the book. So when and where was the Gospel of Matthew written, and how do we know?
Okay, well, we don't know if no is a really strong word, right? Like Cartesian no is certainty, that sort of thing. We can make some guesses. My best guess is that Matthew comes from the last quarter of the first century. That's not an idiosyncratic view. A lot of scholars think this. So that means that it comes after the Jewish War, after AD 70, but it's before the second century. I think there are little clues in the text that point in that direction. I think at least in one place, the author's knowledge of what happened in AD 70 is reflected in the text. In chapter 22, he talks about the king sending troops and burning the city, which isn't in the parallel in Luke. You know, they have the same parable, but Matthew has gone a little different way, and I think that reflects AD 70. So there are these little clues that put Matthew at that point. As for where, well, all I can say with any confidence is I think this comes from the Eastern Mediterranean rather than the Western Mediterranean. This isn't from Italy. It's not from Rome. It's not from Greece. It's over there in the East somewhere. the traditions about Matthew the apostle, and our gospel don't agree on much of anything. People didn't know much, but they never put it in the West, all right? And a lot of scholars would say this comes from Syria, which overlaps, I guess, with modern Syria to a great extent. But they would say it's from Syria, and a lot of people have said Antioch. That's one of the big cities back then in Syria. There are these little hints, but the wisdom, I think, is we really don't know for sure, right? You could say, well, Peter, we know, was in Antioch, and there's a lot of Peter in our Gospels. So, or you could say, well, our Gospel is open to both Jew and Gentile, and there were both Jews and Gentile Christians in Antioch. You can read a lot into these little clues. So if I had to give you a city, I would give you Antioch, but I wouldn't bet more than $20 on it. Right?
Do you think it really, how much does it matter in terms of when it comes to, I understand people are really interested historically as a question, but how much does it actually matter in terms of, or where might it matter when we interpret the text?
So I don't think that where the gospel was written is that important. But I think when it was written matters. So first of all, if the text were from, let's say, the 3rd century AD, you probably wouldn't be looking for it to tell you much about Jesus, right? So it's a 1st century text, so you still have some hope there that it's got some memory.
Sure.
But there are other things. So in chapter 27, Matthew has the Jewish crowd cry out, let his blood be upon us and upon our people. Mm-hmm. And you can ask, what does Matthew intend to communicate by this? Does he stand after 70, and does he see this as somehow explaining what happened before him? That saying has caused lots of commentators to talk about AD 70 in Jerusalem. So is that going on in Matthew's mind? Again, it's relevant when it comes to the so-called Sermon on the Mount, the end of chapter 5, where you have these traditional debates about Christian pacifism and so on. If that's written after the catastrophe of the Jewish war, it might make a difference to how the author is thinking about these things. Love your enemy, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. We didn't do that in the Jewish war. Now we really know what happens when you don't do this. So, yeah, there are places, it seems to be in this text, where a post-70 retrospective view probably affected how the evangelist and the audience heard the text. So I think that's interesting.
What about other historical issues that the opening of commentaries, tend to focus on and think about, like who wrote it, the author's identity, or the audience? Is this intended for a particular community, or is it kind of written to everyone, everywhere, to Gentiles in particular? What are your thoughts on some of those?
Okay, I think I counted 5 questions there. So let me see if I can unpack this. First of all, the text as we know it says Gospel according to Matthew, in all our English Bibles. I doubt that the title is original, although it is odd that there would be a book published without some sort of title or without the audience knowing anything about it. I do have a sort of pet theory about how the name Matthew comes to be attributed to this text. And I draw an analogy with the book of Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible. So what I was taught, and I guess what our students are still taught, was that there are 3 major steps in the evolution of Isaiah, right? There's Isaiah the prophet, the Hebrew prophet, and you find him primarily in the first 1 through 39 chapters, something like that. Although there are other oracles that may not be from Isaiah that are in there. And then some of his students or the school of Isaiah comes on and adds another big block of stuff. And then another somebody or somebody's comes on and adds another bunch of stuff. So that by the time you're done with the book, it looks like most of it isn't actually by Isaiah, right? But it still it still retains the name Isaiah. It started out as Oracles of Isaiah, and you keep adding, but it keeps the name. Again, I wouldn't bet a lot of money on this, but one hypothesis that I've played with a lot is that Matthew stands behind or is associated with initially one of the sources of Matthew, maybe the so-called sane source or the Q source or part of that.
You mean Matthew, the disciple, the tax collector?
Yeah. Although we don't know anything about this guy, so he appears in all the lists of 12, and then there's a story in Mark, which is about the tax collector Levi, but Matthew changes his name to Matthew. Why? The whole nobody's written a book on that yet, but there are articles on, why the name change and what it means. So we don't know anything about this guy, and I think all the later stories are legends because they don't agree about anything. Okay, except he's not over in the western part of the world. But that's all you could say. I can say about identity. I can't give you a name. All right. Yeah. I am certain this guy is Jewish. I'm certain that he's Jewish. I also suspect myself that he's had some sort of scribal or even rabbinic training. There's some really interesting things going on in this text if you look at it closely. A few people over the years have noticed that there are these interesting overlaps between Matthew and traditions associated with a particular rabbi, Yohanan ben Zakkai, who's a big rabbi right after AD 70. That's really intriguing to me. There's also a stylistic habit of Matthew, which screams at me that this guy has to have some association with the rabbis. So there are places in Matthew like 6:19 through 20. This is about, don't store up treasure on the earth where moth and rust, but store up treasure in heaven. If you look at these two sentences in Greek, they're the same sentence. It's just one has negatives in front of a couple of things. And Matthew does this several times. Sometimes his parallelism is perfect. It's just the positive and the negation. And somebody's done work on this. There aren't any parallels to this in the ancient world. You just can't find this anywhere except in rabbinic literature. The rabbis did this. And in fact, there are quite a few sentences like this in something called Mishnah Avot, which is one of the rabbinic tractates. So I think this guy is some sort of, I don't know, maybe you want to call him a scholar. I think he's learned. I think he's had some contact with the rabbis. By the way, I think that's in part why Matthew has more animus against the Pharisees and the scribes than the others. It's because he's left this group. You're always madder at the people closest to you, right? Right. Luther hated Catholics. He didn't hate Buddhists, but he had a lot more in common with the Catholics, right? So I think it's the same thing with Matthew. He's more upset with the people he's closest to. So that's my sense of thing. This guy is Jewish, and he has some scribal training. In fact, there's also that really interesting saying at the end of chapter 13 about a scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven. And a lot of people look at that and say, maybe that's a little autobiography there, right? Maybe that's Matthew himself in the text. And then just one more thing that for me clinches this. When I wrote my commentary on Matthew, one of the things I always did with each allusion to the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament or the Septuagint, I always looked at the Hebrew, I always looked at the Greek, I always looked at the Targums and the different versions and so on. And I came to the conclusion, as have some, that Matthew doesn't just know the Greek. He actually seems at points to know the Hebrew. So if he knows more than one language, if he knows the Greek and Hebrew, then he has to have some sort of training, it seems to me. If he's got knowledge of more than one text of the Old Testament, he's some sort of scholar. Now that was just a response, maybe to
the author, right?
The author,
Who are the recipients of the Gospel of Matthew?
So first of all, I think the answer to that is just a human answer. So just ask how many readers do authors want when they publish a book? The answer is always the same, as many as possible. Right? I can tell you that. That's why I do podcasts these days. So, it's the best advertising for books. So I don't think Matthew wrote this thinking, maybe 10 people will read it. I think Matthew wrote this in the hopes that it would have a wide reception beyond his immediate circle. All right? And I think that while he's Jewish and while he represents a sort of Jewish Christianity, he's also very open to Gentiles. The text ends with the so-called Great Commission, go into all the world. It starts with a genealogy that has 4 women in it, and you ask what do they have in common? One of the things they have in common is they appear to be Gentiles or non-Jews or converts. Galilee is Galilee of the Gentiles in chapter 4. So there are these things throughout that sort of clash with, I came only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, or don't go to the Gentiles or even the Samaritans. Matthew, I think, reflects 2 worlds. I think he reflects the Jewish world, and then he reflects the fact that Christianity is moving out into the Gentile world, and he's not opposed to that. And one of the great things about Matthew, it seems to me, is that if you ask, what's the most popular gospel in the 2nd century? It seems to be, well, if you're looking at Gentile Christian texts, the answer is Matthew. And if you're looking at Jewish Christian texts, the answer is Matthew. That's really a neat trick, right? Yeah. It's really a neat trick. And I think he pulled it off because he's in one world, but he's open to the other world.
He probably also went on a lot of podcasts. That probably helped as well.
That's news to me. That's news to me.
Let's move on to a question which is probably a huge can of worms, and I feel a little bit... it's a little unfair for me to ask you, but briefly, how do you see the Gospel of Matthew composed, right? You've mentioned here that Matthew himself seems to have picked up on some rabbinic traditions, but he's also interacting with other sources. How does this all work out in his relationship with the other Gospels?
Maybe he's interacting with Jesus or something like that. I mean, okay, how do we get from that to a Gospel of Matthew?
So my answer here is disappointingly conservative, by which I mean that I really haven't been able to change my mind in the last 50 years. So I was taught in college and then in graduate school that Mark was the first gospel, that Matthew knew and used Mark. He also knew a collection of sayings of Jesus, and then he had some other stuff, and that it was the same for Luke. Luke knew and used Mark. Luke knew and used this sayings collection, and Luke had some other stuff. When I started writing the commentary on Matthew, this is true. I said to myself, okay, I've pretty much just accepted what my teachers have said about this synoptic problem and their relationships. So this is going to be fun. I'm going to look at every single verse and every single parallel, and every time I'm going to say which thing looks more primitive and what's the best explanation for the relationships I see. And by the time I was done, I was just, gosh, I think my teachers were right, which isn't fun. You can't do anything new with that. Now, since then, there have been lots of people who've come along and said, well, this saying source, this is probably a myth. And it's very popular now to say maybe Luke knew and used Matthew. I don't buy that. I think that's a mistake. Okay. That's wrong. Okay, so my view is that Matthew isn't in front of a word processor, and I think he has to get this right first time through, probably. Now, maybe he has some scribbled notes, but here's what I think. I think he's heard Mark enough, and probably read it too, that he knows it really well. I think he knows the sayings of Jesus in this saying source or cue. So I don't think he has to have these in front of him as he's working. And then I think he also has other sayings of Jesus and traditions and so on. So he's sitting down and he's thinking, okay, I've got this in my head, I've got that in my head, I got this in my head. What do I do with it? I think he, in effect, writes the thing before he puts it down, or probably dictated it, all right? I think he has written the thing in his head. And here's the neat thing. I think you can carry the Gospel of Matthew around in your head if you spend enough time with it. It's not that big a deal. It's just like memorizing a long poem. So Matthew has these, I think they're mnemonic tricks, but he likes triads. There are lots of things that are set into three. I mean, the genealogy right at the beginning is 1, 2, 3, and then we have an angel appearing to Joseph and telling him on 3 occasions, what he should say. You get to the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. You go through this text, and there are triads everywhere, all right? Mm-hmm. I also think that he's got this general scheme in his head, and for me, it's narrative, discourse, narrative, discourse, narrative, discourse, all the way to the end. And what this means is he tells you what Jesus is doing, and then it stops. Everything stops, and then Jesus speaks for a while, and then you get a bunch of stuff. Jesus is doing this and doing that, and then you have a discourse. So Matthew is arranged not just chronologically, Jesus is born before he dies and so on, but I think it's largely topical. And each narrative section has a topic attached to it, a main topic, and each discourse has an outline and has a topic or multiple topics. And I think this guy could carry this around in his head, or carried it around in his head before he wrote it. I don't think it's like Galatians. Galatians sounds to me like Paul just blew his top and started, writing. Right? Matthew's more like the book of Genesis, which is lovely. Chapter 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's just great, right? Or the book of Revelation, for all its weirdness, you got the 7 letters to the 7 churches, and then you got the 7 this and the 7 that, the 7. It's organized, all right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I can carry Revelation around in my head, and I can carry Matthew around in my head. I don't know what the heck Mark is. I can't carry it around in my head. It's a different sort of thing. I don't know what it's all about. But Matthew is well structured, and that's my guess. He's actually been able to compose this in his mind because the whole is broken down to parts, and the parts are structured, and some of them are even numbered in his own mind.
Now, why do you think this gospel was written? Why did Matthew write this text? What purpose does it serve?
Well, first of all, authors always are a little presumptuous. They think they have something to say. And so my guess is he looked at Mark and said, I could do better than this, right? Well, why else do this? And he could look at Q and say, or the same source, I can do better with this. But the question, by the way, I've asked this of myself when I've asked this question of the Gospels and New Testament texts. Why do I, write books? Well, there are always multiple reasons, right? Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Maybe you want to make a little money. Maybe you have a problem you want to solve. Maybe you think you've solved the problem and you want to share your solution with others. I also think it's helpful to ask about great literature. So what's the purpose of Hamlet? Or the Brothers Karamazov, right? Mm-hmm. There are multiple things going on, right? So I'm sure that when Matthew wrote, he was thinking multiple things. I can do better than Mark. We need to remember Jesus. But here's one thing that you can add, I think, to these big generalizations. I said earlier that Matthew was successful in getting a Gentile audience and a Jewish audience. And I think that's part of what's going on in his own mind and why he's writing this. So at the end of chapter 13, where you get that maybe autobiographical reference to a scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven, what does he do? He brings out of his treasure things old and new. Now, that's really interesting. And if you go back to an earlier chapter, is chapter 9, I think, where you have his version of the parable of the wineskins. You don't put new wine in old wineskins. He's got a little phrase that isn't in the other Gospels. He concludes by saying, and thus both are preserved. That is, the old is preserved and the new is preserved. And so here's my feeling for Matthew. This is my sixth sense for what's going on here. Matthew is sort of looking at the church. He's looking at, the new churches and what we come to call Christianity. And I think he's a little worried because he's all for the Gentile mission. But I think he can sense something like Marcion coming along. So Marcion is this 2nd century theologian who draws a distinction between the God of Jesus Christ and the God of the Jews, of the Hebrew Bible. And what does the Hebrew Bible then become for him? It becomes the old that you jettison, right? Matthew is saying, no, that's not what we want to do. We want to keep the old and we want to keep the new. We want to keep the old and we want to keep the new. And for him, that meant keeping the Hebrew Bible, keeping the Jewish heritage. Again, I think he's some sort of Jewish Christian. And his sense is, this is good. We're open. We're converting Gentiles, but we can't be unmoored from our past, from what he calls the old. And so I think of Matthew as in part trying to keep the old, preserve the old within the new.
We've been thinking about kind of the world behind the text, the historical context from which Matthew came. Let's turn towards the text itself. And the first question to ask here is, we call this text the Gospel of Matthew. So what does that term gospel mean? Well,
so that's a term Paul uses, and Paul uses as a sort of summary of the good news that he has to proclaim. It appears elsewhere in the New Testament, but for Paul, it's really a big word. In the Gospels, they don't appear originally with gospel in the title, and there's no place in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John where the word gospel is what you would call a literary genre. At some point, there were multiple gospels on the scene, and sometime in the late 1st century or first half of the 2nd century, somebody says, let's call these gospels. We don't know who that was. But Matthew is already called a gospel or the gospel in the Didache, maybe into the 1st century, also in Ignatius. And sometime in the 2nd century, these are all 4 books that we have are getting this title. So originally it's a term used to sort of encapsulate the gospel, or heck, I'm using gospel to define gospel. The important things, right? The good news, what we proclaim. But then at some point, after the Gospels are written, it becomes a literary genre. And by the way, it's a literary genre that still functions today. So we have the Gospel of Thomas, we have the Gospel of Mary. It seems to me that whenever we have a book that is is primarily about the pre-resurrection Jesus, then we call it a gospel. That's pretty much, I think, how we use this term. And in the 2nd century already, you have the Gospel of Peter. So people are recognizing that it's not just 4 books in the canon that have this title. It's like, well, Paul has letters, but there are lots of letters outside, the New Testament. So there are Gospels outside the canon. So I guess the answer is the word starts out one way, and we still use it in that way. I guess if you go to church today, people use gospel in more than one way, don't they? They use it to refer to the preached news, the preached good news, but they also use it to refer to the Gospels. That's already happening very shortly after Gospel of John appears, I think.
Now, is this a particular genre, a gospel, like at the time of the Gospels, or is it like biography? Is it history?
Yeah,
I mean, where do you?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of discussion, as I'm sure you both know, over the last, especially 30 years, what genre do the Gospels belong to? And people get really, really interested in this. I don't care that much. It doesn't do that. It doesn't do that much work for me. You can have something that fits the genre of history, but it's not written by a great historian. Or you can have a biography that isn't particularly accurate, or autobiography that isn't particularly accurate. A lot of people today, I think, are sort of making an apologetical move if Acts is, if it belongs to the genre of history, or if Luke or Matthew or Mark belong to the genre of biography. Okay, so my own view is that the form of the Gospels has been influenced by Greco-Roman biography, but I think the content is primarily from, or the best parallels are primarily from the Hebrew Bible. So it looks to me like if you want to understand the Gospels, probably the best things to look at are the best things to look at are the narratives about Elijah, Elisha, and Moses. Right? Those, and then all the traditions that are tied to those narratives. So Matthew is, well, when I wrote the commentary, I don't know how much I'd changed my mind today. I just said it's an omnibus of genres. Part of it looks like a catechism. Some of it is like an apocalypse. Some of it is, biography.
Right.
But, books usually don't stay, or frequently don't stay, within the genre they belong to. And genre can be really important. I remember once, years ago, pulling a book off the shelf. It was on the Gospel of Mark, and being deeply puzzled because I had heard none of the stuff in this book. And I realized halfway through it was a novel, but it was presented as though recent discoveries about the Gospel of Mark. So it should have been on the fiction shelf. And so I was totally misreading it and was all confused. Genre does make a difference. But for me, the key is not to be found in the Greco-Roman biographical tradition. The keys are these places in the Hebrew Bible where you get narratives about important prophetic figures doing these miraculous things. Those are the closest parallels, I think. And there are deliberate, there are references to Elijah and Moses in the Gospels, and clear parallels. They're just undeniable. If you would have asked Matthew or John, I think they would have said they were writing something like a continuation of Hebrew Bible history. I think they would. If you'd ask Mark, I don't know. Mark's this great puzzle for me. I can't figure it out. It's too enigmatic. It's almost like notes. It's almost like it's waiting for Matthew to come along and make it better. Luke does conceive of himself as a sort of historian, so...
All right, Dale, we'd like you to take us on a brief journey through Matthew. But before you do, would you tell us a little bit about is there some kind of overarching literary structure to the text of Matthew? You hinted at some of these things earlier.
So look, if you pick up commentaries, you'll see that there are different outlines of Matthew, and people offer different structures. So all I can do is share you my view of things. Now, I'm often not confident about things, but I'm pretty sure Matthew agrees with me on this one. So everybody has noticed that Matthew has these major discourses. It has a Sermon on the Mount. Then it has a discourse to the disciples or missionaries. Jesus sends them out. Then it has the parable chapter, chapter 13. Then it has chapter 18, which sounds like instruction to the church, right, for forgiveness and so on. And then it has, 24 and 25, these big, massive eschatological discourses. So they've not only noticed that the action stops for these discourses along the way, but that Matthew ends them in the same way. You know, when Jesus had finished speaking all these words, there's a sort of refrain. It has little variations, but he does use it 5 times. And for me, that's the key. These are obviously discourses. There are obviously 5. They obviously end in the same way. And if you sit back and look at these discourses, I think each one has a major theme. And then if you look at the narrative material that is in front of and after and between these discourses, I think it's possible to say each one has a sort of theme. So really quickly here, I think chapters 1 through 4 are the first narrative section, and they're just introduction. Who is Jesus? Where did he come from? How did he get here? Baptism and temptation. It's all prelude, calling of the disciples. It's everything that happens before things start happening. And then in chapter 5 through 7, you get what he said. This is the Sermon on the Mount. This is what he said to Israel. These are his moral demands. This is what he preached. And then in chapters 8 and 9, you get what he did. He goes around and you get these miracles and you get these healings, you get these confrontations. It's introduction. Here's what he said. Here's what he did. And then you get the next discourse, which is chapter 10. And here he says, okay, you're going to do what I've been doing. And you're going to preach and you're going to heal and so on. It's sort of a imitation of Jesus type thing. It's here's what Jesus said, here's what he did, and the disciples are going to say and do the same thing. And of course, we're going to offer some encouragement along the way, right? Because things can get hard. And then the next thing makes perfect sense. It's chapters 11 through 12. And there are a lot of controversy stories here. There's a lot of rejection here. There's some acceptance, but it's sort of like this is, okay, Jesus has been introduced. Here's what he said. Here's what he did. Here's what the disciples said and did. And then what happened? How did people respond? And it's a lot of negative response, right? There's some positive, but the negative overwhelms. And then in chapter 13, you get the parables. And the parables are sort of explanation. That is, how the heck do you explain the fact that the Messiah has come and everything hasn't gone swimmingly? It doesn't make any sense. It's like Romans 9 through 11. The Messiah came and this makes no sense. And so you get what are, I think, sort of explanations or maybe even apologetics. That is, how can it be that the Messiah has not been accepted by everybody? And you get the parable of the sower, right? And there are 4 different responses, right? And the devil actually plays a role in one of these. Moral character plays a role. Then you get the tares in the wheat, which is all about the evil one coming in. It's not just Jesus is not the only actor in this play. There's something else going on. So you get what I think are sort of explanations. It's functionally a bit like Romans 9 through 11. How can it be that the Messiah has come and this hasn't worked out? And then the next narrative section is 14 through 17. And this is the first place that you get the word church. And this is where you have the confession of Peter. This is where you get, on this rock I will build my church. It's sort of like, okay, in view of all the rejection, we're going to have some other institution here. We're going to do something else. We're going to have a different kind of remnant over here. And as soon as you've got to church, you get chapter 18, which is a discourse to the church, right? Okay, brothers and sisters, forgiveness, and so on. And by the way, chapters 16 and 18 are the only places in the 4 canonical Gospels where you have the word church, ecclesia. Right? And that's the theme. That's a hint that, okay, we're doing church stuff now, folks. All right? And so Jesus has come. He said things. He's done things. The disciples have said and done things. There's been a lot of rejection. We've explained the rejection. We've founded the church. We've spoken words or discourse to the church. What's left? To go up to Jerusalem and die. And that's what happens then in 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. And then all of a sudden we stop and say, okay, the story's not going to end with the death and resurrection. It's going to go on. So what's coming down the road? So we get a view of the future. And then we get the death and resurrection. So for me, that's the structure. Narrative, discourse, narrative, discourse, narrative, discourse. Each narrative, each discourse has a major theme. You put them together. You can see what's going on here. You get the plot, I think, if you understand the structure. And this is also really helpful for understanding why Matthew moves things around in Mark, because he's thinking thematically. He wants all the stuff having to do with this over here and the stuff having to do with that over there. So Matthew had to have been thinking like this. It just works too well.
And along the way, what are the big theological themes that come up?
Well, here you can go on forever. So you just pick these at random. One feature is the theme of fulfillment. All right. So I think you get a sense of this in all four. Well, you do get a sense of this in all four Gospels, but Matthew has these so-called formula quotations. John has a couple, but Matthew's got a bunch of them. This all happened in order to fulfill, right? And he's bringing in explicitly Old Testament quotations and saying they were fulfilled in Jesus. And this is a major theme of the text, that it fulfills and takes up the Old. And this explains why, in my judgment, Matthew, more than the other Gospels, has a Moses typology. There are parallels between Jesus and Moses in Luke and John and also Mark, but they're clearest in Matthew. You know, Matthew starts after the genealogy with a wicked king on the throne, and he kills Jewish infants, and and the Savior he's going to deliver the people. He's miraculously delivered. And he eventually goes in through the waters. By the way, Paul likens baptism to passing through the Red Sea, if you remember that, 1 Corinthians 10. And then he goes out into the wilderness. He's not there for 40 years, but he's there for 40 days, and he's tempted to idolatry. He's tempted by hunger. And as soon as he's done that, he goes up on his mountain and delivers the commandments. And then when he's done, he descends from the mountain. It's not just the general theme, which outlines modern movies about Moses. Modern movies about Moses have the same structure, the first 7 chapters of Matthew. But there are also these linguistic hints here and there. It's clear that he's borrowing. So it's a sort of replay. And that's part of the fulfillment of the past. Jesus is somehow reenacting Moses, or adding to Moses, or living through a new Exodus. It's not quite clear how you want to frame this, but that's part of the fulfillment thing. Second thing that I would pick out, which is, it's also in the other Gospels, but it's clearest in Matthew. Matthew has what I would call a Christological ethic, by which I mean that Jesus doesn't just say things, but he lives the things he says. So he says, blessed are the meek, and you ask, what the heck is meek? Well, a couple times later in the Gospels, you're told, well, this is the guy who's meek. Jesus is the one who's meek. He's persecuted for righteousness' sake. He does not store up treasure in heaven. He turns the other cheek. One of the fun things to do with the Sermon on the Mount is to go through and look at the correlations between Jesus's imperatives and what he does elsewhere in the text, and you'll find there are a bunch of them. So he's the opposite of what he accuses the Pharisees of being. The Pharisees are hypocrites. Those are people who say and don't do. This is a guy who says and does. So he's a sort of model of his own imperatives. And then the third thing I'd say about Matthew in general is that there's a lot of eschatology here. There's a lot of it. You just think of chapter 24. Chapter 24 is very long. It has its parallels in Mark 13 and Luke 21. But when Matthew's done with that, we had a whole other chapter of eschatological stuff. Right? Okay, one big long chapter wasn't enough. Here you go. Here's some more. And every single chapter has the theme of, every single discourse has the theme of judgment in it. The theme of reward runs throughout. So Matthew, I think, is a very forward-looking text, or maybe it would be better to say it stands in the future often and looks back at the present. It views the present in light of the divine future. So I don't see how you get around eschatology when you're reading the Gospel of Matthew.
Now, among the 4 Gospels, and perhaps if we talked about the entire New Testament, what is distinctive about Matthew? Like, let's say the church did not have Matthew today. What would the church be missing?
Well, you wouldn't have the best version of the Lord's Prayer. You just have Luke's version, which is a spot, right? You wouldn't have the Great Commission, right? You wouldn't have the Great Commission. Right. You wouldn't have the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the Sermon on the Mount has parallels in Luke 6, and Luke 6 is lovely, but there's just nothing like this imposing Sermon on the Mount, which has so captivated so many people down through the ages. And I think often when people think about Jesus, they often think first or second of the Sermon on the Mount. This is sort of what this guy was asking us to do, right? So I think with Calvin that the Sermon on the Mount is Matthew's composition, his bringing together of things that Jesus said on different occasions and so on. But the final result is just absolutely brilliant. And you can spend a lifetime interacting with these things. And these things have become, this discourse has become the conscience, I think it's fair to say, of many, many, many people throughout the last 2,000. It's their conscience. When they walk around and they see something, there are words from that text that say, do this or don't do that. So if Matthew only gave us the Sermon on the Mount, that would be reason to love him. The sheep and the goats, the end of chapter 5, that's just such a memorable text, right? I remember one of my sons, he was very, very little. And, I read them poetry and Cat in the Hat, but I'd read some Bible things once in a while, too. Some pseudepigrapha on off nights. And I remember my son, I don't know what he was, 5, 4? He said, Daddy, let's do the sheep and the goats again, right? He is a little kid, and it caught his imagination, right?
Yeah. Is this why, Dale, you subtitled your book, The Sermon on the Mount? The subtitle is Inspiring the Moral Imagination? I mean, that's a really nice way of putting it. It's become the conscience of many people. I think that's really
that's true.
Insightful.
That's how it works. Anyway, and then the last thing is that I think Luke was written by a Gentile. I think John was written by a Jew, but there's been a break there that I don't think is quite the same in Matthew, an alienation that's not quite the same as in Matthew. And Mark, I think, is written almost primarily for Gentiles. I think it's Matthew that still has half of himself or more than half of himself in Jesus's Jewish world in a way that the others don't. And that we get a sense here of Jewish Christianity that maybe we don't get elsewhere. Paul, of course, is a Jewish Christian, but he's writing to Gentiles, right? So we're always in the Gentile world. And it's one of the sad facts of history that what happens is Christianity becomes entirely Gentile at some point, and you get these references, like in Justin Martyr or Jerome, for example, to these Jewish Christian groups that probably thought of themselves as in the line of James or in the line of Matthew. But they're very marginalized, and they die out sometime in the 4th century or something like that. We still have a sense or feeling, I think, of Jewish Christianity by reading this gospel, a feeling that we don't quite get from Paul or Mark or Luke or John.
Great.
So I would hate to do without that.
Yeah. So we've thought about the world behind the text, the historical context of Matthew. Now we've thought about the text itself, its basic structure and some of its main themes. Now we're going to turn briefly to what we might call the world in front of the text. So how Matthew has been used and how Matthew has shaped later communities. So let's start with the question of Matthew's place in the canon. So why is it the first book in the New Testament? Why is it the first of the Gospels?
Okay, so if you're really into divine providence, you could say because God wanted to put it there. But if you're not into divine providence, there is no answer. So if you look at all the Greek manuscripts that have multiple gospels, Matthew is usually the first, but it's not always the first. There are collections in which Mark is first, and there's some collections where John is first. I don't think Luke is ever first. And nobody knows why this happened, right? Why, somebody put them in this order. Who was it? Nobody knows. Why? Nobody knows. And why was it the case that after this caught on, there are still people who feel perfectly free to put them in a different order, right? It's you couldn't do that today, right? You're not going to come out with the new extra revised version with Mark first. It's not going to happen. Matthew has to be there. But if you were to ask me just to guess, I would guess that whoever did this was probably thinking chronologically, because there was a tradition that John was written last, and Augustine thinks Matthew was written first, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking somebody said, okay, let's put these in chronological order, and that would be Matthew, Mark. That was somebody's guess as to what it would be. So beyond that, though, we just don't know. Sometimes the Gospels circulate by themselves. That's the case originally. Then we have some evidence that maybe a couple of them circulated together, and some evidence that maybe 3. But at some point, already in the 2nd century, there are 4. So there have to be collections of 4, and somebody decides on an order. That's it. So not very enlightening. Can't do anything with it theologically, unless you're a deterministic Calvinist.
Sure. Well, Dale, let's... I'm wondering if you could pick out a few major persistent issues that the church has grappled with in its interpretation of Matthew throughout the ages. What are they? I will signal this. This was, I mentioned at the beginning, I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning, but this book is one of my favorites. Yeah. And in it, there is an essay. So the book is Studies in Matthew, Interpretations Past and Present. Published by Baker. And there's an essay in here. It's the first, actually, chapter, The Magi's Angel. And this is the one that you mentioned at the very beginning when you mentioned the star. And actually, I read this and I was like, wow. I'm thinking of the star when I'm reading the Gospel of Matthew, how it leads, the Magi to the exact location of where Jesus is born. And then Dale just kind of blows it out of the water by going to he goes to the Hebrew Bible, but he also goes to ancient Christian interpreters on how they interpreted the star. And lo and behold, a number of Christian interpreters say, well, the only way that this star could have led the Magi to the exact location of Jesus' birth, it couldn't have just been a star that was way up in the sky. How do you find the exact spot? It must have been an angel, right? And I mean, this was just, blew my mind at let's say the treasure troves that are in the church's interpretive history. But Dale, I wonder if you could point us to what are some major trends or issues that the church has grappled with as they interpreted Matthew.
Okay, so if you look at Matthew, one of the things that has to come up is 16:13 through 20. Now that's the passage where Peter confesses Jesus to be Messiah, and then in Matthew, but not in the other Gospels, you get this blessing of Peter and, on this rock I will build my church. Mm-hmm. Now that becomes at some point really, fairly early on, really important for the Western Catholic churches, because this becomes the office of Peter, and it was instituted by Jesus, right? Well, during the Reformation, as you know, this was not an acceptable reading. And so you had to interpret the text otherwise. But even before that, there's a difference between the Eastern Orthodox churches, or the Byzantine churches, and the Roman Catholic Church. What the heck do we do with this? How do we understand Peter? Is he representative? And throughout the last few centuries, we have people who have repeated the sort of Roman Catholic interpretation, the Orthodox interpretation. There are Protestants who want to put Peter as low as possible, right? And make sure he's just one of the other disciples, and they're just Christians like the rest of us. Anyway, there's a huge debate on that. And I find that when students come to seminary, still a lot of them are interested in this passage, and they've been taught certain things like the rock can't be Peter. Of course, it couldn't be Peter. It must be faith or something like that. So this, still goes on. How do we interpret this so we don't become Catholics or right? In the Protestant tradition. A second thing that's always there is Matthew 5:17 through 20. Think not that I came to abolish the law and the prophets. I came not to abolish, but to fulfill them. And every single commentator, every single one says, that doesn't sound like Paul, right? It doesn't sound like Paul. So how do we fit this with Galatians, or how do we fit this with Romans? And then we get a whole batch of explanations of how we can put these two things together. So that's always there. And if you were to ask me about Matthew, those are the two things that would jump to my mind. But there's another thing that's close to my heart. So Matthew has been used down through the centuries in very anti-Jewish ways. The text in 27 especially, his blood be upon us. And anti-Jewish readings of the gospel are all over the place. There has been, I think, a helpful questioning of this in recent times. I've been part of that questioning myself. My own view is that Matthew is still an intramural text. That if you look, for example, at the Hebrew prophets, they say horrible things about Israel, horrible things, but they say them as Israelites, right? The same thing in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I have argued, and it's my hope, that that's who Matthew is. Matthew is still part of the people, and he still has a hope for them, and he's not writing them off. But the text has been read as though Matthew has written them off for good, and Jesus had written them off for good, and now there's nothing but Gentiles. So that is maybe not so much a discussion that's been going on through church history, in the sense that people have taken both sides, because the tradition has been, I think, pretty sad here. But it's certainly an issue in recent times.
Well, speaking of books or other things that we might recommend, we like to conclude our conversations by asking our guests for a blurb. So, and it doesn't have to be a book. It could be a life hack. It could be a TV show or whatever. Now, before we ask you for your blurb, your recommendation, you've just had a book that's come out very recently in the last couple of weeks or so. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a book called Encountering Mystery, Religious Experience in a Secular Age. And it's not written by the biblical scholar. It's written by a human being and a Christian who's been interested in religious and mystical and metanormal experiences his whole life. The reason I'm in this field, the real reason, forget all the academics, the real reason is because when I was 16, I had this unbelievable mystical experience, encounter or something or other. And I've really it's what got me into this. It's what said, maybe the word God isn't just some sort of projection. Maybe it refers to something, right?
Wow.
So I've paid attention to religious experience my whole life. I'm a big fan of William James. And anyway, this is my attempt to reflect on, both personally and critically in an informed way, on mystical experiences, on experiences surrounding deathbeds, on miracles, on claims to answered prayer, on experiences that are allegedly encounters with the demonic, and so on. Mm-hmm. And I do this with an open mind. I don't have a closed, flat universe, but I also try to engage the psychological literature and the critical literature and so on. So it's my attempt to deal with this very important but very difficult area. Okay,
yeah.
So
well,
that's what that is.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Is there anything else that you'd recommend to our listeners, a book or something else that you've come across recently?
Well, so one thing did come to mind. I knew you were going to ask this, and I was thinking, have I read any really good books lately? Well, that's silly. I read books all the time, and I'm at an age where I usually can't remember the title or the author. I just know where it is on the shelf, so if I need to go get it, I can find it again. But everybody in the field is familiar with E.P. Sanders, Ed Sanders. Mm-hmm. And, he wrote a big, important book on Paul that came out a long time ago. But just 4 years, maybe, he published this big, long book called Paul, something like his life, letters, and teaching or theology or something like that. It's this big, thick book on Paul. And I read it, and I just think it's fantastic. I think it's the best book on Paul I've ever read. I think it's the best orientation to Paul, if you want to get oriented, or if you just want to remind yourself of the issues, or you just want to see what a great scholar thinks about Paul, at the end of all his work, looking back, this is what I've decided. I just think it's really, really fine. And it's just Ed. There are very few footnotes. There are very few references to anything else. It's the kind of book I hope I can do on something someday, where I don't have to spend half my time in the library, right? Figure out what somebody else said recently. It's just what Ed thinks, and it's really, really good. I really like it. So if you're interested in Paul, it's big, it's thick, but it's also the kind of book you can jump around in, because you can read the chapter on Romans, and then you can read the chapter on Corinthians. You can skip around.
Great. Well, thanks, Dale, for taking the time to guide us and our listeners and orienting us to our coming season through the Gospel of Matthew. And to you, our listeners, thanks for listening and tuning in. If you enjoyed this orientation to Matthew, please go on Apple Podcasts, give us your best 5-star review. And you can find us at the2testaments.com, where you can catch all the episodes as they come out on Matthew and on other books of the Bible. Until then, thank you.
The Two Testaments is produced with support from Samford University, where Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes are professors in the Department of Biblical and Religious Studies. Thanks to you, our fellow travelers, who support this journey by donating on our website, the2testaments.com. Thanks also to Cam Thomas, Joe Zeldner, and the team in the Samford Faculty Success Center, and our student assistants for their help with production, editing, and promotion.